We're going to be talking about justice, governance, and collective security. Let's see if I can, okay. My orientation is rather conceptual. My friend Bill, his approach was looking at the practical level, and it's wonderful. I would like to start basically using some conceptual framework. And this hopefully underscores the fact that both are important. We need both action, because without action, change is not going to happen. But actions also need to be directed by clear thinking, by principled concept, and by a well-defined notion in our mind. If our mind and our thoughts are foggy, guess what the action is going to look like? So I'm going to mainly discuss some areas of understanding about justice, governance, collective security, mainly relating to these, mainly relating to distributive justice, as we'll see, and see what are the factors affecting these notions, what are the assumptions that we are making about these concepts, and perhaps what are some alternative approaches. Oops. So I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and the reason for that is for us to be reflective. In other words, since I see many young faces and minds here, this presentation is not about giving you answers. It's posing a question and then having a lifelong journey for us to find the answers for ourselves. And I'm hoping that perhaps later on we could collaborate together to maybe just have the first steps of finding answers together. And as I mentioned, we would like to definitely explore some of the assumptions behind current thinking. So let's just take a quick look at where we are today in terms of distribution of wealth, and I'm going to show how this is going to affect our discourse coming up. If you look at a trend of distribution of wealth, this is a typical graph, and there are quite a few similar graphs which discuss distribution of income. But this is distribution of wealth from 1979 to 2007, which shows the cumulative growth in real annual household income. And as you can see, this one that is going drastically high, this is for the top 1% of the population. And this line that is below, and sometimes is actually below zero, which is kind of going up and down, that's for the bottom 0 to 20% of the population. And what this is telling us is that in the span of about 30 years, the wealth of the top 1% of the population has increased by 250%, whereas the wealth of the 0 to 20% has increased by an average of about 10%. In some cases, in fact, it has gone down. Essentially, this to me, in the long run, is a flat growth rate, which means almost zero. But let's just give it the benefit of 10%. The question is, what is the consequence of having realities like this from a conceptual framework? So I thought perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to just have these three concepts. And you may ask, why is this triangle not straight, perhaps pointing upward? Basically, I did not want to give any sort of a weight to any one of these topics because they're all important. And I'm not usually dyslexic, but in this case I'm definitely not. So the issue is, let's just say in terms of justice, and in particular distributive justice, the justice of distribution of income. If our distribution of wealth is so lopsided, is so extreme, then the question is, what's going to happen to the concept of governance? Mr. Davis said governance means a steering. if 1% of the population has the capability to control, whose wealth is growing by 250%, who has more than 60–70% of the wealth of a nation, I wonder which direction is this governance going to be steered? In whose interest? Okay, if we are governing, whose interest are we preserving? Or whose interest are we securing? And then the question is this collective security really the security of the all, or the security of those who have the highest means? In fact, in economics these days, there's discussion about $1, one vote, meaning that nowadays we're not one individual, one vote, but based on the consumption and our purchasing power, the minute you spend your dollars, you're casting a vote. And I'm afraid these notions are very much affected by the way wealth and income is distributed. I'm not going to go into the technical aspect of this because we don't certainly have the time. This is an entire course in economics itself as to discussing different aspects of justice. So today we're just going to look at what are some of the theories of justice that help us make the link between these two, and I'm sure my colleague Dr. Mani is going to perhaps discuss aspects of collective security. So the question is justice for who? Governance towards which objective? And collective security to preserve whose interest? Whose interest are we trying to serve? The answer obviously is human interest. But then the question is which interests? How do we determine human interests? Are these material interests? Are these social interests, spiritual interests? Are these artistic interests? Essentially, what type of interests are we talking about? Secondly, who determines what these interests are? Is it individuals? Each individual should determine their own interest? Is it a society that determines the interests of people to themselves? Should there be a dictator? Should there be some power up there who determines the interests of everybody else? And what is the conceptual basis for determining human interests? On what basis do we even want to approach this issue? As you can see, then determining this interest becomes quite a fundamental question. Now, it looks like it's clicking, it's red. All right. So in order for us to look at these interests, I'd like to propose 3 ways of looking at society and the way these interests are distributed, okay? Because at the very core, if we, depending on which concept of society we perceive or we believe in, it shapes the framework for then defining those interests. So a simplest form of a society is what I refer to as an airplane perception of society. And that is basically a number of individuals coming together as if they're getting on an airplane. And how are these people relating to each other in an airplane? Well, basically they are sitting in certain arrangements and everybody has an assigned seat. And what is their duty? Well, I usually don't have any particular duty towards the person who's sitting next to me, other than just being polite and make sure that I don't disturb them. So this society is basically, the interest of this is the sum total of the individuals in the airplane. As soon as they get off the airplane, that society doesn't exist anymore. But then we could also have a factory perception of society, meaning that, well, there is an objective. We all get together, just like in an airplane, well, we go to a factory, but all of us have an objective. All of us have a goal to perform, and that is to produce something. In order for us to do that, we have to discharge some specific responsibilities put together by the management of the factory. Okay? Therefore, unless I do my job, the next person is not going to be able to do his job. So I need to be mindful of making sure that I discharge my responsibilities. But other than that, as soon as I'm done with that, I really don't care what happens next. We could also have a family perception of society. This is thinking of society as an organism, so it would be an organismic concept. Which it's definitely this type of a society, and it's also this type of a society, but it actually goes one step further. It looks at a society as an integral whole, as a living organism of which I'm a part. And my well-being depends on the well-being of the family, and the well-being of the family depends on the well-being of the individual. So think of it as a body which has cells. The well-being of the cell depends on how the entire body functions. And the well-being of the body also depends on how each cell is functioning. So it goes beyond just a functional relationship, it's also a matter of interdependence. So to summarize, these are some consequences of having different perception of society. In this one, as I mentioned, the question is, how can I make this organism, this family, better off? What is not only my role and responsibility, but how can I look at the interdependence of myself with the family and family with me? So, the basis of the airplane perception of society is what we refer to as individualism. Meaning it is the individual who is the primary decision maker. The individual has primacy. Okay, so once the individual is gone, then basically you don't have a society. In a factory perception, it could be any number of these perceptions. It could be individualism, it could be pluralism, meaning that these individuals are coming together, form a plurality, and make decisions based on majority vote, or other ways. Or it could be, in fact, a dictatorship. You know, essentially, in the factory, there is a boss, and whatever the boss says, we all know it. All right? But in the family perception of society, we have this interdependency. In fact, in all of these, I'm actually being quite brief so that I can take advantage of time, just like you said, I'm speaking faster than usually in my normal speed. So when we look at the society as an organism, what are the characteristics of such a society? As I mentioned, the number one characteristic is interdependency. In other words, the interests of the individuals are inextricably linked to the interests of society. You can't separate these two interests from each other. The second principle is reciprocity. In other words, the health, security, and survival of both the individual and society are based on mutual support. It's not just that I can do my function and go home, but it's the mindfulness that how can I constantly be thinking about myself and about the family, about the society in which I live. The third characteristic is the concept of trusteeship, which is rather, perhaps it may be alien to us, it may be a new concept, and it's that as soon as an individual is born into this world, into the family, then it becomes a trust for that family. The family is the trustee to take care of this child. And when the body is born, each cell is in trust of this entire body. Okay? So in a sense, the totality has an obligation to take care of the cell. And this essentially is the origin of human rights. In other words, when we say we have the right to life, as soon as a person is born, the society is obligated to take care and commit itself to make sure that this cell is alive and grows. So this basically forms the foundation of our rights. I have the right to live because I'm part of this organism. Finally, another characteristic of this model is governance, which means that as soon as you think of a family, or basically a body, it's not all a flat structure, it's hierarchical. That means, by hierarchical, we don't mean necessarily a dominance model, that there is a head that dominates the rest of the body, but that there are different levels there are differentiations in cells and in organs, and each organ has its function, and they need to collaborate with each other. So when you look at a body, there's a head that does the thinking, and there's a foot that does the walking, and there's a respiratory system that does the breathing, and all of these come together in the form of a hierarchy. And one cannot say that basically a brain cell is more important than, let's say, a nail cell. Nonetheless, if the brain is not functioning properly, the nails will not do their job. So then in this case, what is the purpose of justice in society? The current thinking in justice, and I'm sure Bill and others have a lot more to say about this, is basically how can we balance competing interests of individuals. This is based on the airplane model, or the functional society, where basically we look at the primacy of individual interests, and the issue is how are we going to balance these interests. But then the question is, how can we in fact do that? The question of justice and how we can balance these interests have been discussed enormously by many, many economists, and I'm trying to encapsulate this in about 5 minutes if I can. Well, John Rawls is one of the pioneers in the concept of justice, and he wrote his magnum opus, A Theory of Justice. And his basic foundation of justice is that any idea, any notion of justice must be based on impartiality. In other words, it cannot be based on individual self-interest. So the question is, how do we get there? He says, imagine a society that exists before we in fact form our own society. Suppose we are all in some primordial world before coming to this world. And he calls that the original position. And in this original position, none of us know what is going to be the outcome of where we're going to end up. I don't know whether I'm going to become a doctor, I'm going to become a laborer, I'm going to become an artist, so I have no idea what I'm going to become. And he calls that the veil of ignorance. So all of us are behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing what we're going to end up being. So he says, in these circumstances, how are we going to decide how to distribute goods and services in an economy? Because not knowing what we're going to become, I could become a poor person or I could become a rich person. So depending on which one I become, how would I vote right now as to how we should distribute goods and services? And he says basically, if people are rational and impartial, they're going to vote to basically distribute everything equally. However, if there is some degree of inequality, the rational people would vote in such a way that the most deprived person gets the highest benefit. So in this case, if I get to be a rich person or a well-off person, then I'm fine. And if I'm a poor person, I know that the society is going to maximize my interest and my welfare. So that's, he says, behind the veil of ignorance, this is how people would vote, and that basically creates a just society. So he says impartiality is number one. Later on, we have another prominent economist, a Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, who recently, in fact, came up with a book called The Idea of Justice, which is very prominent. In fact, he examines all of these. And he asks a fundamental question. He says, is impartiality the necessary and sufficient condition for justice? Is it just sufficient for us to be impartial? And he gives a very simple example. The book is about 400 pages, so obviously I cannot discuss all of that. So I'll just cite one example that he gives, really puts in perspective the whole notion. He says, suppose there are 3 children, 3 kids, Anna, Bob, and Carla, and there's a flute. And the question is, who should get the flute? Okay, so it's a distribution of wealth. Anna says, I should get the flute because I'm the only one amongst the 3 that can play the flute the best. I mean, I've gone into training and I know how to play music, and of course that's what the flute is for. So from this point of view, of course, a person who can play the flute should play the flute and should have it to play the flute. Bob says, yes, you're the only one who can play the flute, but I was born in an underprivileged environment. You guys have lots of toys and I have none at all. I should have the toy because at least I can play with it. Even though I'm not a good player, I can play with it while you all have lots of toys that you can play with. So that's essentially a Marxian perspective. Carla says, yes, Anna, you can play it very well. And Bob, I understand that you don't have much, but I'm afraid I made the flute. So whoever makes it, gets it. So then basically these are three current notions of distribution. This is utilitarian justice, this is Marxian justice, and this is basically based on the theory of ownership. Whoever owns it gets it. All of them are well accepted impartial theories of justice. But in this case, I'm afraid we're not going to have much of a solution. So he says that basically we need to have a rational democracy to achieve justice. Well, rational democracy is, none of these are wrong, by the way, and that's what I meant to say by collaborate. All of these are important. And each one basically goes one step further. So basically, the third alternative is to have a consultative democracy, in the sense that the family comes together and knowing that each individual has the right and the privilege of expressing their interest, the family together consult in a dispassionate manner of what is best for the family. And this model is obviously very new, and it's being tried, and it's, in fact, it exists in reality for examination to see basically which one of these models works the best. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to go into the details of these models. Hopefully my colleagues are going to explain more. But at the end, I'd like to just share with you something that at least hopefully will remove our misconception about how wealth is distributed, so that you can understand the magnitude of this extreme distribution and the implications that it definitely has on our society, both in terms of economic distribution and in terms of politics, in terms of governance, and in terms of collective security. So this is about 5 minutes, which is hopefully a good ending to my presentation.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash, and let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.